services industry employs hundreds of thousands of people in Canada. But aside from the tellers at the branch, there are a huge number of jobs that remain a mystery to the average person. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, you work for Scotia, so you're a banker now. You were not always a banker.
No.
You started working on shampoo.
I did.
How does a nice guy working on shampoo end up at a bank?
Well, I started with Procter & Gamble out of my undergrad, and then decided to go back to school, did a graduate degree, and then found my way into management consulting. But the industry I worked on in that business was banking. And so after doing that for a little while and another venture, I found my way kind of going back into the banking side of the business, if you like, in industry.
You're 10 years old. You're looking ahead to your future. Was banking in the cards?
Never.
Never?
Never.
So what changed?
Well, I had, like I think a lot of people, this view that banks were big, and I tend to characterize myself as more entrepreneurial.
They are big, Dan.
But you know, when I sort of break down the size of, say, Scotia, which has about 30,000 people in Canada,
right,
it's really kind of hundreds of small departments.
Gotcha.
And so I ended up chatting with people who worked there, who worked in the financial services industry, and you know, what they described to me was not a kind of big, slow-moving bank, which was sort of my perception.
You've had an interesting time at Scotia in that you've dipped your foot into a whole bunch of different lakes. What has led to that kind of path for you?
Well, I was interested in the variety that a bank offered, and so I started in marketing because, as you mentioned, I had a prior experience in that sort of function. And then, you know, after working in the retail products and marketing area in the head office for a year or two, I raised my hand and said I'd like to move into a new business, and that was wealth management. And then moved again because I was interested. And the bank was really open to that. They were keen to move people around and give them good experiences.
You talked about the misconception around size, that sure, it's a big organization, but there are lots of smaller units in that in which one can be entrepreneurial. What are some of the other misconceptions that you would point out to people today that you may have, you know, been able to slay as you learned more about the business yourself?
I think a lot of people think of banks or financial services companies as employers of people who are numbers oriented. So you need to like numbers, be good at numbers to work in that industry. I think that's an absolute myth. Obviously, that's really important in certain types of jobs. But you know, in Toronto, for example, in the big banks downtown, each of the big banks has hundreds of people who are marketing types, literally. You know, if you want to work in marketing, you should think about working at a bank because they have large marketing departments. Scotia has probably about 100 people in Toronto alone doing marketing. And so that's generally a business that's seen to draw people who are more creative as opposed to purely analytical. So that was a surprise to me.
What are some of the other functions that people might not think of when they think of banks? I mean, they think of retail. I think a lot of people would think money management because they may have mutual funds at one of the big institutions. What other functions would they not necessarily be aware of?
Well, I would say you know, we have a government relations department, you know, which interfaces with that group. We have an investor relations department because as a bank that's publicly listed, our institutional investors want to understand what we're up to. So those are sort of relationship type jobs. We have an enormously large systems group. And so if you're interested in working in a company that has a lot of technology happening, big investments, big projects, plus a lot of testing going on, I think financial services needs to be a place you should consider.
When you look ahead to your career path, what are some of the things that you see, or what are some of the conversations that you have with folks about where you want to head?
Well, I always think it's really important to think about sequencing certain moves. And so with senior people at the bank who I've become lucky to get to know, you know, we've talked about, well, which job would be better to do before another one? And so as I think about career development, I think about what options the next job opens up. Some jobs are sort of good platforms from which to move into other experiences. You see people sometimes take an opportunity to move out of a head office environment into a sales management type job in what people refer to as the field. So out in one of the provinces and come back to head office, and that positions you for different types of next moves. So sequencing jobs is important, I think.
On what sort of frequency? How quickly do people change roles? And I know that's hard to think about in terms of an average, but...
Yeah, I mean, most people, 3 to 5 years would be sort of the norm, if you like. A lot of people prefer to stay for longer. not everybody, is super hungry for extreme variety and extreme change, and so they tend to stay for longer. But in 3 to 5 years, if you're in the same job, that job's changed substantially.
Right.
So people who move fairly quickly would be at the short end of that range, and we see a number of people who stay within the same department for kind of 10 to 12 years and have 2 or 3 different job types.
All right, Dan, we're going to take a brief break. More on careers in financial services when we return. Welcome back. We're talking about careers in financial services today. Dan Rees is our guest. I want to ask you about the international component, because of all of the big Canadian banks, Scotia's brand positioning, for lack of a better phrase, is international, in particular in developing countries, and a lot going on in the Caribbean. From a career perspective, how does one capitalize on, maybe a little bit of a time on a Caribbean island, for example?
Well,
more than a week.
More than a week. I would say in Toronto, which is where the International Bank is, it's run sort of centrally out of our head office. There would be some 500 or 600 employees who help run that business, much of which, as you say, is located in sort of central Latin America. And so those people, whether they're in marketing positions or business development positions, are often on projects, and so spending time not just working with, but going down and visiting people in those countries who are running the work. So there's exposure and there's direct contact. If people in Canada are interested in working in the Caribbean, for example, or in Mexico, where we have a substantial number of employees, some close to 10,000 now in Mexico, starting in the Canadian head office is a great way to begin.
Could you justify a trip to the Caribbean just to do retail branch checks, for example? Could you have one of those jobs?
That might be a bit of a stretch.
A bit of a stretch.
That might be a
All
bit
right.
of a stretch.
I want to ask you about fit, because a lot of people talk about it. They talk about it as a part of the recruiting process. And in terms of the financial services industry, what are the questions that you would have candidates ask themselves to self-select as to whether or not it's an industry that would be a fit? Or Scotia in particular, whether or not it'd be a fit?
Well, I would say genuinely, Bruce, that the nice thing about the financial services industry or a bank, one of these big employers, is that it's important to think about fit, but probably more so, in my view, with the company before the job, because there's multiple jobs.
Right.
And so if you get the fit mostly correct at the outset, but not perfect, you've got opportunities to move. Some of the questions that I would encourage people to ask to self-select include, what type of environment do you want to work in? That sounds kind of textbookish, but do you want to work in an environment where you're in an open trade floor and everyone's got screens, much like this, and computer? Do you like that kind of frenetic environment? And if you do, think about the trade floor. If you prefer to be more of a business development lone wolf in a car and out sort of generating business, you should think about being a mortgage development manager or an investment executive. And so sort of the actual work environment, I think, is really important for job satisfaction, because that affects the relationship you have with the boss and how big your peer group is and kind of what drives you. And a lot of those can be found within the financial services industry.
I want to come back to this idea of big versus entrepreneurial. And a lot of people have the preconception that banks are only second to government in terms of bureaucracy, right? They face it as consumers at the branch level. What have you found for yourself has allowed you to navigate, call it bureaucracy, call it just working in a big company, which is systemic in big companies. They're inherently big. Yeah. What have you found helpful in navigating that?
Well, I think big companies benefit from momentum, so that it takes a while to get things rolling, and then when they sort of drive into the market, it's got a big splash. So that's an advantage. However, what often happens, I think, is people who tend to be entrepreneurial tend to kind of find themselves rolling with that momentum, as opposed to saying, hang on a minute, like, who's actually going to buy this product at this place in the retail bank branch? What customer would actually do that? So groupthink can be a big problem, I think, in a large employer or a bureaucratic type environment. So to get past that, those I think do well tend to imagine themselves as being consumers of whatever's going out the door, and speak very candidly, directly about what they think might be wrong with the direction that the group is going in. So that, in my view, has people sort of standing out, and it allows people who are entrepreneurial to flourish.
I'm going to ask you a tough question.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you to put words to what a human resources function or a senior management team might have written on a piece of paper somewhere, But from your experience working at Scotia, what would you say are some of the values that are most resonant to you? Values of the corporation.
Number one for me is integrity, and I see that a lot. I see that. I think it's integral to be a good banker to be demonstrating integrity regularly, and you see that a lot in how we think about taking on certain types of clients, generating certain types of transactions. So, for lack of a better way of putting it, compliance. I mean, these things are extremely important. It's a relationship business. So if you don't have integrity and the client doesn't trust you, you can't do banking.
Right.
And so we see that a lot. We think it's extremely important. It's one of the bank's core values. And I think it separates us a little bit from the pack.
Banking stocks have done extraordinarily well in the last 5 years or so. And a lot of Canadians, whether or not they work at a bank or not, have benefited from that move. Layer in this compensation question for people who do choose financial services, how they are positioned, and this is general and comp differs in an individual basis, but how they could benefit if they chose to work in this industry.
Like, picking up on your sort of reference to stocks, every single employee at Scotiabank, as the example, if you like, gets an opportunity to benefit in share ownership program. And we've had this program now for some 20 years. And so, I would imagine that at this point, based on the bank's stock growth, an individual employee who'd been in that program now is, got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars inside their RRSP as part of the employee share ownership program. Right. And I'm not talking about senior executives. I mean, employees of the bank, period, get to participate in this thing. So that's something that's not quite as well known, I would say. Right. And for many people, it's a substantial sum as part of their retirement. And
a perk to being in that environment versus any other that had similar work satisfaction but not as much stock growth.
That's right. And I think you'd probably classify the insurance companies as having that kind of stock growth and those kinds of share option programs. So beyond the pension, which I think a lot of people associate with banks, for example, the ownership program in stocks is extremely attractive.
Well, I'm going to leave you to go count your money now. Dan, thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Bruce.